This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Speak to Sadiq. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, takes your calls.
Very good morning to you. I am James O'Brien, not Sadiq Khan, although the Mayor of London is sitting socially distanced alongside me. If you'd like to ask him a question about anything under the sun, to be honest with you, then the number you need is 03456060973. No prizes for guessing what I expect to be fairly near the top of the agenda. And also that story you just heard in the bulletins about TfL's future, no less, will be something we'll examine. But I'll give you an opportunity to put the questions first, except, of course, on the question of Tier 2, which we are now in. But you are supportive of the government's decision, although you would prefer a national circuit breaker. Is that right? That's
a really good summary, James. Good morning. Can I just say this? There are no good options. Basically, what we're seeking to do is to learn the lessons from March. And one of the lessons from March is the earlier we bring in restrictions, the better chance to save lives and livelihoods, but to continue to give the NHS the headroom they need to continue not just COVID care, but non-COVID care as well. And I'm continuing to lobby the government for additional support for our businesses, for our councils, and for individuals and workers as well.
And how would you describe the scenario in Manchester? You and Andy Burnham go way back, so you'll be au fait with what's unfolding behind the scenes.
What I'd say to the government is that they really shouldn't treat mayors or leaders of councils across the country as adversaries or with suspicion. What Andy Burnham is seeking to do is to make sure the government understands the consequences of some of their decisions. And he's tried to be collegiate. He's tried to make this point for a number of weeks now. And what I'd suggest to the government is talk to Andy Burnham, talk to leaders of councils in that part of the country, because they've got real grievances with the way the government appears to be imposing restrictions on them.
So the strangest element of this, and we'll move on after you've answered this question, is that the opposition to moving into Tier 3 has united Labour and Conservative MPs in Greater Manchester, but for two very different reasons. So the Labour contention is that we would go into Tier 3 if we felt that the financial support was sufficient. People would be on, I think, about £5.60 an hour under the current proposals if they were ordinarily on minimum wage, whereas, as I understand it, the Conservative MPs who are also opposing the move up to Tier 3 are doing so more on a scepticism or an opposition to lockdowns full stop, as opposed to the circumstances of this specific escalation.
Yeah, there are libertarian arguments. Well, the short point I'd make is I've taken the trouble, as I know you have, of reading some of the advice prepared by experts appointed by the government, so-called SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group. Actually, what SAGE say is the most effective way to slow down the spread of the virus is to have, for a couple of weeks, a national circuit breaker, which would be really hard for those 2 weeks, but it would avoid months and months of additional restrictions. Unfortunately, the government has rejected that advice from SAGE. So what we're left with is these three buckets: Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. There are trigger points between each of the tiers, but they are really restrictive of our liberties, but also damaging to businesses, council budgets, and to individuals potentially. So what the government needs to do is what governments in France and Germany and Norway and elsewhere around the world has done, is until they finally sort out the test, trace, isolate system, which is crucial, by the way, in the absence of a vaccine, in the absence of immunity, they've got to give proper financial support. And that's what Andy Burnham and other colleagues around the country are arguing about. And I'm also, trying to persuade the government to change their minds so we can have support, even though we're only in Tier 2, inverted commas, because I recognise the huge hardship caused to particularly hospitality, the pubs, bars and restaurants, but also culture, leisure, retail, tourism, but also individuals and workers who may need to self-isolate and take time off work.
So if you got the call today saying it's Tier 3 for London, would you be Steve Rotherham or Andy Burnham? Would you go along with it?
Well, no, I think that's unfair to characterise it as Steve versus Andy, Liverpool versus Manchester. What I would do is look at the evidence.
Don't, because one of them has gone into Tier 3 and one of them hasn't.
Yeah, but to be fair,
so what would you do, yes or no?
To be fair to Steve Rotherham, the government was going to go into Tier 3 anyway, and what he sought to do is to get the maximum financial support he could, knowing full well that the government was going to go into Tier 3 anyway. What Andy Burnham's seeking to do, because the government isn't there yet in relation to Manchester, is seeking to, in advance of Tier 3, get the maximum financial support. I think I hope the government's not trying to paint Liverpool versus Manchester or sort of a divide and rule type politics. What I would hope they would do is realise mayors and leaders across the country want to be allies of the government, not their adversaries.
And to be clear, if they insisted on Manchester going up to Tier 3, Manchester would have to, and the same would apply to London, regardless of...
Yeah, the law's quite clear, unfortunately. Yeah, the law's quite clear. It's a government decision, preferably to work in consultation with metro mayors and leaders. The government can impose, but the obvious point is it affects compliance if you've got respectable, credible local leaders who would be good message carriers saying don't follow government advice. And that's why it's really important to try and work together.
To the phones. It's 9 minutes after 10. Matt is in Harlow. Matt, you're through to the Mayor.
Good morning, James. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning, Matt.
My question is, if me and a friend who both live in separate households both take separate transport to, say, Hertfordshire, which is still in Tier 1, to a restaurant or a pub, are we breaking the law or are we going against advice?
Good question, Matt.
It is a good question.
Yeah, so the way to think about it, the simplest way I can explain it is the person living in the highest tier with the greatest restrictions use those rules. So if in Harlow you're in Tier 2, what you can't do is go to an area with less severe restrictions, Tier 1, and use the rules there. And the same goes if you've got a visitor coming to you from a lower tier, Tier 1, he or she should follow the rules of Tier 2, which means because you're in separate households, unless that friend of yours was your support bubble, you couldn't meet them indoors.
You kind of knew that, Matt, surely, but you highlight, I think, the lack of absolute clarity that covers so much of this strategy.
It was a rather long-winded way of answering. I just want to know, is it illegal or is it non-advisory?
Oh, that's a good point as well. Is it guidance or law?
Well, that was my question.
Yes.
It is the law. So, Matt, what you're in Harlow. Are you aware what tier you're in, Matt?
Tier 2. But
Okay.
if we went across
So
the border to the county, we'd be in Tier 1.
Well, let me answer your question, Matt. No.
Thank you.
Does that help? Was that short enough for you? Good.
Slight delay on
Next
the line.
caller. Maybe somebody a bit more polite and courteous. Have a good day, Matt.
Brevity from Matt to Matthew. Matthew is in Richmond. Matthew, what would you like to ask?
Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, Sadiq. Hi, I'm a London bus driver. Can you hear me?
Good to talk to you, Matt. Really good to talk.
You're loud and clear. There's a slight delay on the line, which is going to be irritating for everybody.
Matthew, so what it is we're in the LBC studio in Millbank, and that explains the delay. But it really is good to speak to you, Matthew. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to say thank you for the restrictions that TfL put in place to protect the passengers and ourselves, the bus driver. The unfortunate thing is that it feels like for those of us that are brave enough to try and encourage the public to follow the rules, unfortunately, it seems like it doesn't go far enough. It seems like there are only some bus drivers that do it because of obvious reasons, but obviously the bus drivers don't, because we've been told for our safety that we shouldn't. So now the public have now got into getting back into sort of the old ways of thinking it's acceptable to get on without a face covering, thinking it's acceptable to challenge the driver when it comes to the maximum passengers. And I'm just wondering, like, we play these announcements and they are helpful to a certain degree, but I think the public are now starting to think that the announcements are not actually meaningful, so they don't actually believe that TfL will enforce it.
So it's fraying.
Matthew, thank you really very much for raising your point. Can I just first deal with the issue that you raise around bus driver safety? So you'll be aware, and you know the affection I have for bus drivers. One of the reasons years and years ago, before my time, perspex screens were installed in buses was to avoid you and your colleagues being assaulted by violent passengers and the like. We've made sure that your safety is a paramount concern to us. We've changed the perspex screens and done other things to make sure you're safe and passengers are safe. But you're right, there is a concern we have about what's called, and apologies for using this word, but fatigue of people not following the rules because, the message just goes over their heads because they've heard it so many times. So what we're doing is, in addition to the TfL enforcement officers, and British Transport Police, we're working with colleagues across London for a new campaign to remind all Londoners of their civic responsibility to follow the rules, as well as the law being the law in relation to wearing a face mask when you are on public transport, or indeed in shops or hospitality as well. You'll be aware we don't want you to risk your personal safety by enforcing these rules, and so that's why we've employed TfL enforcement officers and British Transport Police. Up until now, Matthew, more than 110,000 people have been spoken to, and more than 550 fixed penalty notices have been issued on public transport in London. But you're right to remind me of the importance to making sure that we relook at our campaign. What I'll do, Matthew, is I'll speak to the Commissioner later on today to remind him of the importance to not just give you the support, but to remind all passengers to do the right thing. And you'll be aware, Matthew, the vast majority of Londoners are doing the right thing. There's a small minority who may have forgotten, they may not realise, or they may just be deliberately breaking the rules, and we need to just make sure they are following the rules, because they're risking your safety and the safety of other passengers and buses as well.
Matthew, how often are you encountering actual aggro as opposed to what might be fatigue or simply forgetfulness?
I actually find it's now more they feel they can challenge us when it comes to trying to limit the amount of passengers. And that if we have any sort of opinion towards it, it's not regarded as everyone's safety. It's the annoying bus driver who doesn't have any power to enforce the rule.
So, Matthew,
it'd be nice at the busy bus stops maybe to see some sort of help with either PCSOs or something, just with us or someone from TfL that we can exchange together, so that the public know that it's not the bus drivers on their own. Yeah, and a quick one just to get in there as well is that I quite get full in the peak periods, and a lot of the time I will have my iBus controllers telling me to delay and hold back because of the regulated service. And at these times of day, it seems really ridiculous that they want me to wait at a bus stop full of 14 passengers.
Matthew, what bus garage are you at?
You know.
What bus garage are you at, Matthew?
I'm in South London one. I'm not really sure which to say which one because obviously.
Okay, don't do that, Matthew. I don't want to put you in the spot, Matthew. Look, so what I do is look, just so you know, Matthew, I'll follow it up with Richmond area, South London. We've got what's called spotters, and what spotters do is help us, particularly around the school buses. You'll be aware, Matthew, we've taken on 200 plus additional buses to avoid school children being congested with non-school children passengers, and the spotters basically do what you're saying, which is they're at bus stops and they are looking at what the numbers are, so they can report that back in to increase frequency or reduce buses and move them elsewhere if that is the case. Let me look at speaking to colleagues, and I didn't mean to put you in the spot, Matthew, I apologise, about what we need to do in South West London to make sure the service is properly configured. What you're referring to, for James's purpose, who may not realise, is basically we try and have a frequent interval between buses to avoid 3 buses coming at the same time. That's what Matthew's referring to, the regularisation, the frequency. That causes problem with the new social distancing rules. And so, Matthew, let me take that away and look at what we can do to improve that, because it's really important we sort that out. And can I just end, Matthew, by thanking you for the brilliant job you're doing. We were clapping for carers every Thursday. I made sure during that time that we reminded everyone that people like you are also heroes, as well as those who work in retail, those who clean hospitals and bus garages and the like. And I'm really grateful for the hard work you do day in, day out, Matthew.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for explaining to me how buses work. John is in Golders Green. John, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Good morning, Sadiq. Following on from Matthew's question... Good morning, Sadiq. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, mate. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay.
Okay.
It's our fault, not yours.
Following on from Matthew's question, I would like to ask you why you have not... to my knowledge, there are approximately 300 stations in London. I don't know how many buses there are. Why have you not put... some people with some beefy guards with appropriate enforcement authority outside the entrances to each one of these stations and on every single bus to ensure that people cannot get on a bus or enter a station without wearing a face mask, and similarly on every train carriage as well, to the extent it can be done. Because as far as I can see, if I get on a train or a bus without a ticket, this is pre-COVID, I would be liable to a fine if I get caught, and I would be liable to prosecution, whereas this is the law of the land and nothing is being done.
Well, the short answer, John, is because we haven't got the person power to do that. You mentioned the 300 tube stations. In addition to those, we've got overground stations. In addition, we've got tram stations. In addition, we've got 20,000 bus stops. Just to answer your question, we've got 700 bus routes and 9,000 buses. And so it's not humanly possible for us to have enforcement officers, British Transport Police, or indeed Met Police at every entrance to public transport, or indeed every shop or every hospitality. What we're seeking to do is a combination of enforcement, but also a combination of explaining, educating and encouraging people to follow the law. And it's really important people do so. By and large, Londoners are doing the right thing, but you're right to remind me, John, that some Londoners aren't, and that leads to the virus potentially spreading, particularly because it's asymptomatic, so you may not know you've got it. And that's why, as I explained to Matthew, what we're looking at is improving the communication plan and the strategy to, in a non-patronising way, educate Londoners about the importance of wearing a face mask. If I wear a face mask, it keeps you safe. If you wear a face mask, it keeps me safe. And the other thing is, asking Londoners to do the right thing. Of course, we will continue to enforce. As I said to Matthew, we've had conversations with more than 110,000 people to put a mask on where they're not. There have been a number of fixed penalty notices issued, 550 by TfL team, 1,000 plus by Met Police over the last few months. What we don't want to do is to divert Met Police officers from doing the serious crime stuff, the violent crime stuff, to be doing enforcement of face masks. And that's why I'd say to you and generally to other LBC listeners to please follow the rules. They're there to slow down the spread of the virus and keep all of us safe.
Briefly, what happened to the volunteers that were supposed to be enforcing mask wearing?
You mean the government marshals? Yeah, so councils didn't have the money to hire the marshals that the government talked about. The government has announced some additional money for councils, not enough to do the stuff that John needs. John wants every bus stop, every station to have these marshals. The marshals are also working, James, in shops, in retail, in hospitality, in pubs and bars. And that's why the more of us that follow the rules, hopefully the less there is a need for enforcement. And it's really important that all of us understands that masks work. They can lead to less of a chance of the virus spreading, and that's why it's really important we wear them.
Just to add to that, listening to Matthew writes Tariq, and as a bus driver in London myself, I have to agree with him. We're getting more abuse on a daily basis by trying to uphold the rules sent to us by TfL and the government. It feels like we literally have no backup with regards to enforcement. I think at 21 minutes after 10, that's the biggest takeaway so far from this morning's calls. Ross is in Peckham. Ross, you're through to the Mayor.
Hi, good morning, James. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning, Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for all you've done for London since 2016. My question is, myself and my partner, we don't live together, and we can't form a support.
I'm going to have to come back to you, Ross, and try and improve that phone line. It can't be helped. It obviously went south between you being put through to the studio and speaking to the producer. So we'll go next to Matt, who's in Putney. Matt, you're through to the Mayor.
Yeah, hi, James.
Hi, Matt.
And the gremlins are back in the system again. Let's go to Bruce, who's in Sheffield, which I don't think falls under the Mayor's remit, but I suspect that the question will reveal why you've called. Bruce, what would you like to ask Sadiq Khan?
Good morning, James. Good morning, Sadiq.
Morning, Bruce.
I'd just like to ask you, how much work's going on behind the scenes to save the London theatres at the moment? Because when we come to London, we love to go and see the shows in the theatres. So I just wondered, is there still a lot of work going on?
Yeah, Bruce, there is, but not enough.
Yeah.
So, Bruce, from City Hall, we've given some of our money we've got to theatres, to those who work in the theatre industry, culture at risk, live music venues, to try and keep them going, keep them on life support during this difficult time where they've got no footfall, or virtually no footfall, to make ends meet. Also, this week, the Arts Council England divvied up some of the money given to them by the government to various theatres and venues in London. It's nowhere near enough, Bruce, and my additional concern, other than the theatres, is those freelancers and others who work in this industry who've had no support from the government since March. Think of those who do makeup, those who do the lighting, even actors who are freelancers who've had no financial support and are now if they haven't already, given up in the industry and working elsewhere to make ends meet. And you enjoy the theatre as indeed I do, but it's worth reminding anybody who's listening from the government that culture contributes more than £52 billion to our economy every year, and 1 out of 6 jobs is in the cultural industry. And when I speak to investors in other sectors, finance, legal, tech, one of the reasons they choose London is because of our rich cultural offer. And so it's really important that we get additional support to the theatres, not just theatres, live music venues, indeed freelancers, those who work in this sector. It's really important. It happens urgently, because my worry is if the Prime Minister is right, and we've got another 6 months of these measures, in the absence of a proper test, trace, isolate system, I'm not sure, Bruce, if many of the theatres will survive until next year.
Well, I wish you all the luck in the world. I hope you do manage to do the best job you can, and you're doing a great job.
Thanks, Bruce.
Being in Sheffield, and stay safe.
Stay safe, mate.
Briefly, I saw an event at the London Palladium last week, I think featuring Arsene Wenger, the former Arsenal manager, and a lot of people found themselves wondering how that can go ahead, but we can't watch the football.
I was perplexed. I've asked questions about this.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense to me, because, if it's the case that event is safe, then it begs the question, why aren't other events allowed to take place, or even outdoor sporting events? I'm not sure if that was something that fell through the cracks, but the basic rule is it's not rocket science. You don't need to be a member of SAGE. The more time you spend with somebody indoors in close proximity, the more chance you've got, without precaution, to catch the virus. And I didn't see any face mask wearing either. And it's really important that people are aware of the rules and follow the rules. And, I would rather people were going to theatres, even if it's keeping their social distance or wearing a face mask. And it's, in my view, one of the anomalies. You can go in an aeroplane for a number of hours wearing a face mask, but you can't go and watch a performance wearing a face mask. And it's one of the things that I think the government needs to look into after taking relevant advice.
And you mentioned freelancers. You'll be aware that their plight has gone largely unremarked by the government. A lot of these people constitute the 3 million so-called forgotten. There's no light at the end of the tunnel for them. I know young people who work in the arts and in some of these attendant sectors who have moved out of London because they can no longer afford to stay here.
Yeah, and we've been continuing to lobby the government. They were missing from the Chancellor's furlough scheme announcement earlier on this summer. Actually, those who are self-employed, who aren't freelancers, also got a rotten deal.
Yes.
And the problem is, you're absolutely right, not only will they leave the industry, they will leave the city, because they need to make ends meet. Some have returned back to live with mum and dad to save on monies and stuff. And the problem is, you can't turn the tap back on when people leave an industry. So if it's the case that there's a vaccine found next year, or the government finally sorts out test and trace so we can return to some sort of new normality, there is no pipeline of people in these sectors, and they rely upon freelancers going from job to job and job to job. And the other thing we've got to be really live to is, if other cities and other countries have a more effective test, trace and isolate system, not only will they leave London, they can leave our country and go to other countries and offer their talent there, because they can move quite easily and they're quite mobile.
Apart from the abolition of freedom of movement.
Well, it's quite remarkable what's happened in this summer in Brussels. The government agreed before the COVID pandemic began that the transition period would end on the 31st of December. They've been understandably preoccupied, like the rest of us, with this pandemic since March. Their bandwidth is taken up with this pandemic, rather than doing the sensible thing and saying, you know what, let's have an extension of the transition period until we've got sorted out COVID, either a vaccine or turn the tables on COVID, and then we can properly, rationally, calmly negotiate a trade deal. They are determined to end the transition period at the end of this year, which will mean one of two things: either a no-deal Brexit or a basic deal Brexit. If you think it's been catastrophic so far for our businesses in London and the country, that'll be amplified hugely by a no-deal Brexit or a bad deal Brexit.
Where would you put your money at the moment? I know you don't bet, but metaphorically speaking,
I think there will be a deal. I think what the government is trying to do is to manage expectations down, and Johnson will claim that he's got a deal and he's the saviour, and he had a plan all along, and he should be trusted. What people don't realise is, at the moment now, any deal is a bad deal. And when you look at some of the world-leading sectors in London, finance, law, professional services, tech, creative industries, all of them will suffer as a consequence of the red tape mountain created by a bad deal Brexit or a no deal Brexit.
28 minutes after 10, Roslyn Peckham was going to ask, before we lost that line, whether the established relationships rule still works for couples. What's the score if you are courting, to use an old-fashioned word?
Ross, it's worth you checking the regulations, but basically, if your partner doesn't live with you in your home, then he or she can be your support bubble, and so you can see each other in each other's homes. And that's basically the rule.
What if your partner is in a shared home?
Good question. So if your partner is in a shared home, then he or she is still in your support bubble. You're allowed to have one support bubble. The more complicated thing is where people are students in halls of residence. You can imagine students returning home for reading week or whatever. So if your partner is living in a home with other people, he or she is still your support bubble.
But then that would mean you weren't allowed to see anyone else. That's your
one support bubble. So indoors, you can still see them outdoors. So invest in a good coat, gloves and scarves, but you can't see them indoors.
But that works for. Sorry, I appreciate these aren't your rules, but two single people living alone, that's easily negotiated. What about two people living in multiple occupancy households? I don't think they can they, under the guidance?
No.
So you can't see your partner if you both share a flat?
Under the current rules, that's my understanding, yeah.
It's not very romantic.
Well, and this could potentially go on for months and all the rest of it. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, can I just say, that's one of the practical reasons why a short-term national circuit breaker for 2 weeks, for me, makes more sense. Why? It's going to be painful for 2 weeks. It really is going to be hard. With the right financial support for the businesses and for councils and for individuals, let's get through the 2 week pain, and then hopefully it will mean we won't have months and months and months of restrictions, which, as you said, it's not only not romantic, but it's really hard on the mental health of people as well. Can I just say, by the way, James, for those of your listeners, particularly for those from other political persuasions, the tech problems aren't down to me. So I don't want # blame Sadiq Khan for any LBC technical problems.
Technical. Thank you. Yes, we'll avoid that. Matt is in Putney. Matt, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yeah, hi James, hi Sadiq. I'm a London taxi driver. COVID-19, TfL policies like bus and the late down obliterated our trade. Like an electric taxi costs about £1,000 a month, which I have on finance. The TfL Commissioner, the Mayor, and Heidi Alexandra, his Deputy Mayor for Transport, have not met the trade officially since this pandemic began 7 months ago, which I think is pretty poor, actually. And I just want to know, Sadiq, what plans has he got to help support drivers during these really difficult times?
Well, Matt, I wasn't aware that neither Andy Byford or Heidi Alexander had met the LTDA or Unite, who are the two bodies that represent taxi drivers. So let me make sure that happens, because it's really important that I'm sure it has. By the way, Matt, I'm not saying you're wrong, but necessarily, but I think you may be. Let me take that away. If it hasn't happened, I'll make sure it happens urgently. We are in regular contact with them. I know we are. So we'll sort that out. We have done things recently to try and help in this difficult condition for black taxis. You'll be aware TfL itself has had massive impacts on our revenues with the consequences of lockdown. We've lost 90% of our income stream. I'll give you just one example of the sort of stuff we're doing to help black taxis. We've started piloting 24-hour bus lanes and allowing black taxis to use those to accelerate the journey times, obviously safely within the laws, when you're taking passengers, which is something called for by black taxis, something we've delivered on, and we're hoping the pilot is a success, including persuading councils, by the way, to allow taxis to use their bus lanes. I think 93% of roads now in London, black taxis are allowed to go, and wasn't the case before I became mayor. You mentioned the cost you're paying for your electric vehicle, particularly hard when you've not got passenger revenue, passenger fares coming in. But you'll be aware one of the things we're also doing is helping those black taxis, and we continue to do this even though money is tight, move from diesel taxis to the electric vehicles, which are cheaper in relation to fuel than the old diesel. But you're right, it is tough for TfL. It is really tough for black taxi drivers, and we're hoping we'll make a deal with the government so we can continue to support your industry, which is really important. I'm
going to ask you about the TfL situation in a moment. Before that, Sky News is reporting that, and I have to tell you that these words appear on my screen like a ticker tape. So when the words "a deal has been done" appeared, I did find my attention being rather piqued to find out what deal it was but it is to move Lancashire into Tier 3, and a source from Lancashire County Council has told Sky News that they want, quote, significant concessions and additional cash from government. I'm sure you'll be having a good look at that as soon as we're finished.
Yeah, I mean, just to say to Londoners, although we're entering Tier 2 tonight, all the indicators we have is that the virus is spreading in all parts of our city. So although, we're nowhere near Tier 3, and hopefully we never get there, by us following the rules and going early, we hope never to get to Tier 3, and we hope at some stage to go back to Tier 2 and then not to have any restrictions at all.
The TfL situation, for people who aren't fully across it, that mention there of 90% collapse, I think we can say, in revenues means that you need government money from central government in order to keep stations open, to keep buses running, and most obviously to keep the people that staff the entire transport network paid. Last time you went to them, to use a phrase, cap in hand, and they put various demands in place. You would not have got the money to keep Transport for London afloat if you hadn't removed free travel for youngsters and extended the congestion charge to weekends. And yet politically that hasn't played well for you. An awful lot of Londoners, I speak to them every day, think that you've imposed these restrictions on the city autonomously, which means now you go back to them for even more money. A cynic might suggest that they're about to tighten the thumb screws upon you facing election next year still further.
Well, I hope not. We're in negotiations with the government. I'm annoyed that it's taken us until this week to get into proper negotiations. We were ready early August to negotiate a new deal. I said back in May the deal we had for 6 months was a sticking plaster. We need a sustainable deal, bearing in mind for the foreseeable future. There will not be 5 million people using 5 million journeys on our tube, 5.5 on our buses for some time to come. I'm hoping the government does right by Londoners who, by the way, have done the right thing by following the rules. I'm not somebody who goes around regularly saying London contributes far more to our country's prosperity than they give to us. And for the government to be saying, they don't think London's transport authority should be subsidised by the government doesn't reflect the facts. And the facts are the government, by the way, gave the privatised train operating companies 18 months worth of grant without strings attached. Yet they're saying to TfL, we're giving you a 6-month deal with strings attached, and we're now negotiating for the remaining part of this year and hopefully next year as well.
What might the new strings look like?
Well, I'm not going to give a running commentary on the sort of terms they're offering, but what you've said is a fair reflection of the view that I've got, which is I don't think you should punish Londoners for doing the right thing or add conditions to us that you don't attach to others. You've seen the consequences of the widening of the C charge to weekends, but also the increase to £15. I've been quite clear, taking away free travel for under 18s is not something that I would support. And so it's really important that the government sensibly works with us. It's in both of our interests to get TfL running. Why? Because if TfL is running, it means that London is running, but also London needs to be successful for the country to be successful as well. We can't be successful without a fully functioning, fully funded TfL.
Let's move on to Bethan, excuse me, who's in Hackney. Bethan, you're through to the Mayor.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for taking my call.
Good morning, Bethan.
Hi, my question is actually regarding EWS1, and it relates to the report earlier on LBC regarding potentially fraudulent forms being issued. So our building in Hackney was issued with a certificate back in April, and the cladding was given an A2 rating, which is a pass. And so believing we had this valid EWS1, we sold our flat and then put an offer into that on a house. This was obviously post-lockdown. But then we discovered that the original form issued actually wasn't genuine. So we raised this with the old managing agent, and we were then given a second form. But this form was signed by someone completely unqualified to sign. We've now been told a third form is on the way, and it's being reviewed by an independent surveyor. But obviously, we're assuming that this one is also going to be suspect. So the upshot is we don't actually know whether the cladding on our building is in fact safe. We've got a 4-year-old and an 11-month-old, and we just don't know whether obviously our sale will go through and when and if we can move on. So is there anything that you can do as Mayor on a London level to crack down on these firms, which seem to have completely exploited the situation? And this whole EWS1 system, which was already not fit for purpose, has been completely undermined by these kind of unscrupulous people.
Beth, I'm really sorry for what you're going through.
It's an astonishing story. Did you hear it earlier?
Yeah. Let me just deal with Bethan's call, then with Rachel's report, which I thought was excellent on LBC earlier on today. So, Bethan, there are thousands of families like you. We think 600,000 across the country who are struggling with the sort of thing you're talking about with the EWS1 form. I wrote to Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State, last month on this issue of the EWS1 form in relation to a number of concerns I've got about the Building Safety Fund being inadequate to remediate poor cladding, but also there are all concerns about the quality of the inspections. Many of the inspectors, by the way, are asking for support because they haven't got professional indemnity insurance relevant to your case if there's been a survey that you're not happy with, but also to make sure that people like you aren't living in a property forever, not being able to sell it because you've been, you can't sell it because you can't reassure the potential purchaser that it is safe, nor the building you're going to can you be reassured is safe. And so as a consequence of the report today in LBC, I think it's really important for the government to look at this issue because the reality is only the government can sort this out. I think what the report from LBC showed today is there's potentially criminality taking place, and it's both for the trading standards departments but also for the police to look into whether people are by fraudulent means misrepresenting people in relation to the safety of a building. And I'd make this point: potentially lives are being put at risk because of these potentially dodgy, allegedly dodgy surveys. And that's why it's really important that both trading standards and the Met Police Service look into the report from the LBC. But also, as far as your particular case is concerned, Beth, and I'm sure your solicitors are advising you what to do, it's worth you speaking to your surveyor about any professional indemnity available to cover you for any losses you've incurred.
You'll make sure this is on Cressida Dick's desk, presumably. Well,
can I just say, I think potentially the report today from LBC could save lives, because what is uncovered is potentially, allegedly, I need to use those words for obvious reasons, James, there could be people saying building A is safe when it's not, and so a family moves into there and thinks the stay put advice applies in relation to the built environment, and it doesn't. So what I'll do is make sure that both trading standards and the Metropolitan Police Service are aware of the LBC report to look into whether there are potential criminal offences taking place, but also trading standard offences taking place as well.
And just out of curiosity, how will you do that? How does it work? Do you finish here and then ring the Commissioner and say, did you hear LBC this morning? We've really got to get a grip on this immediately.
Yeah. I may not ring the Commissioner directly, but I'll make sure her office knows about the report. The Met Police Service does have a team that listens to the media, but also is aware of public interest matters. So we will make sure that her office and the trading standards team are aware of the LBC report to make sure they look into the concerns raised by LBC's Rachel Venables.
Also, I should add, our North West reporter Tom Dunn is reporting that Lancashire County Council have currently told him that nothing has been confirmed with regard to those new Tier 3 restrictions. This isn't ideal, is it? Is it inevitable? Is there any other way of doing this, or do we have to have the kind of, the deadline, the fears that people will treat it like they did in Liverpool as an invitation to fill their boots just before the deadline kicks in at midnight, or the idea that from day to day we're not quite sure where we're going to be?
Well, the real problem is this: we're in a crisis. There are confused communications, mixed messages, but also this lack of clarity about what is effective because of the issues you talked about in relation to Lancashire and Manchester. And my concern is, does that lead to less compliance because people haven't got confidence in the rules that follow, the restrictions that follow a area going in from one tier to another? And that's why it's really important for the relevant policies to get around a table and to work out what the right way forward is. And the government will need to give the financial support that the businesses, the councils, the individuals and the workers need. And by the way, giving the financial support means that people are more likely to follow the rules because they're not taking risks with their lives because they've got to go to work to make ends meet, and a business isn't taking risk or cutting corners because of the concerns they've got either.
There's a ICU doctor in Manchester, finally, Sadiq Khan, reported this morning to have told leaders there to shut up and shut down now because the situation has already escalated so badly. What's the score in London hospitals, particularly obviously in intensive care units?
Yeah, so if I was speaking to you last month, I'd have said to you we have on a daily basis 5 new people going into hospitals in London. I checked this morning, we have 73 every day now going into hospital. We currently have more than 400 patients in hospitals with COVID. The concern is not simply to make sure we've got sufficient capacity in the NHS to look after COVID patients. What we don't want going into winter is non-COVID patients. Think of the cancer sufferer, those who need a hip replacement, cataract sufferers, not getting their treatment because the NHS is overwhelmed by COVID patients. So by us going into Tier 2 tonight, what we're doing is continue to give the NHS the headroom to look after COVID patients should they need it, but also non-COVID patients going through autumn and winter as well. And one of the reasons I was keen to work with leaders across London of all political parties, but also the government, was to not simply give the government more time to finally sort out test, trace, isolate, but also to continue to give the NHS the headroom they need going into this autumn and winter.
So what is capacity in London? How do you know? What is full? What is the breaking point, as it were?
ICU is roughly speaking 1,400. 1,000. If it goes to 1,050, the ICU then the hospital starts doing new things, taking people away from non-COVID care. So think about the tipping point of being about 1,050. After that, non-COVID care is affected.
Right.
And so we've got capacity for more than that, about 1,300, 1,400, before you even think about night.
Doesn't sound like a lot, does it?
That's ICU.
Yes, no, I understand that, and I appreciate that's the worst case scenario.
At the moment, we've got decent headroom. ICU's got more than sufficient capacity, but that's why we need to keep the headroom there. Why? Because in 2-3 weeks' time is when you start seeing hospital admissions after people being tested positive, and what we're seeing different this winter is younger people rather than older people. And the other piece of good news I want to give you some hope is the NHS is now learn how to deal with COVID patients. So whereas previously they'd been ICUs longer, they're now in shorter, which frees up capacity as well.
Mayor of London Sadiq Khan, many thanks indeed, and don't forget to bring that report to the attention of the Commissioner at the first opportunity. It's just coming up to 10:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. After the break, I think we'll turn our attention from London to Manchester and the rest of the Northwest and wonder how you're feeling, actually, as your local government, your mayor, appears to be increasingly at odds with your Prime Minister. And, of course, that division between Conservative MPs and their own leadership adds temporarily to Andy Burnham's case, but they are, despite both being opposed to moving up to Tier 3 at the moment, they are basing their objections on very, very different reasons. Where does it leave you as a resident of that area, wondering who's in charge and whose lead would I prefer to follow? It's 10:45.
Weekends at LBC with Andrew Castle.
Why wouldn't a national lockdown be acceptable in your view?
We've got to think of the economy, jobs, education, all of these other factors.
So when a politician says we're following the science, that's ridiculous. I don't think I hear many scientists talking enough about the balance. As soon as you hear follow the science, you just go, you can't just follow the science, because what is it?
Andrew Castle, every Saturday and Sunday morning from 7. LBC.
As the clock ticks down to the start of the new